Hi, I'm James Hamilton from Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal, and today we're going to start a new project that I think you're going to enjoy. It's a bench for your entryway with built-in storage for all your gear. There are 2 drawers beneath the seat and 4 cubbies for shoes and boots. On top there are 4 more cubbies where you can put baskets for more storage, and there'll be hooks beneath those to hang coats. It's a great way to organize all the stuff that never seems to make it into the coat closet. But this project is special for another reason. It's specifically designed to help new woodworkers improve their skills. In fact, even if you don't plan to build this project, you're going to learn a lot from watching me do it in this video. Of course, woodworkers of all skill levels will enjoy it, and you can use whatever tools are available to you. But I carefully designed this project so folks without a shop full of tools can build it. You don't even need a table saw. It's part of a series of projects we've developed around the circular saw. Not only can you build these projects in your backyard if you have to, but each has introduced new techniques to progressively improve your woodworking skills. For example, the first project in the series was a bookshelf that included a layering technique to create sturdy dados without special tools. Then we built a storage unit, which introduced basic drawer construction and edge banding. Both of those projects were made primarily from plywood, which is an ideal material when you're working with the circular saw and an edge guide. But today we're going to take it up to the next level. This is a solid wood project with the strength and beauty of an heirloom piece. We'll still use a circular saw, but now we'll be making both cross cuts and rip cuts. We'll also introduce a router for cutting solid, accurate dados and rabbets. And we'll complete the project with an easy to apply colored wax finish that'll give it a beautiful aged appearance. This project will require 2 videos to complete. After the second part is released, I'll also release a set of plans that you may use to build the project yourself. At that time, I'll put a link in the description below this video. Just click on the little arrow if you're on a phone app, or show more if you're watching on YouTube. These plans are important. I carefully designed this project so it could be built using common materials you can buy in any home center. The goal was to minimize the amount of rip cuts required for those without a table saw. So the cut list in those plans utilizes standard board widths and lengths whenever possible, and that is really helpful. I recommend clear pine if you can get it. This stuff is expensive, but it's beautiful, and there are very few flaws. That's important if you don't have a jointer or a planer to flatten and straighten warped boards. You can buy standard pine if you like, but the more knots in the boards, the more likely there will be sharp bends and twists. Clear boards are usually flatter, and if they do cup or bow, the bends will be more gradual. As you'll see, you can work with gradual bows by forcing the boards flat as you assemble the project. Whatever you use, try to get the flattest, straightest boards available. Drive to more than one store if you have to. Now I'll be making my cuts with the Bora WTX edge guide and saw plate, just as I did in the plywood projects. Now you may think this is a bit of overkill for cross-cutting boards that are less than a foot wide, but you'll really see this thing pay off as we progress into the more challenging cuts. Here I'm setting the blade depth so it will cut just through the wood and slightly into my OSB work surface. I'm also using a good 60-tooth circular saw blade, not the cheap blade that came with your saw. I can't stress this enough. You need those 60 teeth to make clean cuts without a bunch of ugly tear out. I like to use a scrap of wood to support the end of my edge guide that hangs off the board. This will keep the saw from tipping forward at the end of each cut. Cut each part out carefully using the list provided. This wood isn't cheap, so measure twice, cut once. While you can cut out most of the parts right now, it's a good idea to leave the top and bottom trim pieces a little extra long at this point. We'll cut them to the perfect length after the project is assembled. When I attached my saw to the plate, I carefully set it so the blade was 2 inches from the channel that fits over the edge guide. This makes it easy to account for the offset. I just add 2 inches to every dimension. Just remember to always put the kerf in the waist portion of the wood. Otherwise, your cut will be off by the thickness of your saw blade. A few of our project parts have to be narrower than the standard lumber widths that are available in stores. So you're going to have to make some rip cuts with your edge guide. It's a good idea to clamp the board down if at all possible. I also cut the board to a shorter length so my edge guide can handle it. I can get 2 project parts out of a 48-inch long board. I used the same blade for the rip cuts that I used for the cross cuts. As you can see, you can make some very accurate rips with the circular saw and edge guide. Some boards have to be made narrower, others have to be made wider. Don't stress out too much over edge gluing panels like this. If you don't have nice Bora panel clamps like these, you can rig up a clamping board with some wedges for a low-tech solution. I recommend sprinkling some salt in the wet glue. This will keep the boards from sliding out of alignment as you apply the clamping pressure. The salt's just going to dissolve as the glue dries. It's important to align your parts carefully so you don't have a lot of sanding to do to even out those seams later. Now you're bound to get some glue squeeze out. I say just let it dry for a little bit until it's sort of like cottage cheese, then scrape it off. If you wipe it off when it's too wet, you're going to smear it and force it deeper into the fibers. And if you wait until it's hard, it's going to make your work much more difficult. It's time to cut some dados. We'll begin with the side panels. The location of the dados are laid out in the plans. Mark them carefully. Take note that the two sides of this bench unit are mirror images of each other. So make sure you cut the dados on the proper faces or you'll be cussing and swearing your way back to the lumberyard later. The easiest way to accurately cut these dados is with one of the router plates that goes on the Bora edge guide system. It slides on the guide just like the saw plate, so your router can't drift away from the cut. And it's super easy to align. There are marks on each side of the plate. Put the guide on the workpiece and align those points with the marks that you made to indicate the center of your dado on the board. One on the near side, another on the far side. When those are aligned, lock the guide down and you're ready to cut. The plate comes with a bushing which you attach to the bottom of just about any router. Make sure it's centered, then drop the bushing into the hole on the router plate. The weight of the router will keep it in place. There's no need to clamp it down. With a simpler straight edge like this one, you'd have to cut only in the right to left direction, or else the spinning of the bit would pull your router away from the fence during the cut and your dado would be crooked. But with a plate that attaches to an edge guide like this one, you can cut single pass dados in any direction. Now this comes in handy, especially when you want to avoid tear out as the bit exits the cut. So what I do is I begin the cut on one side of the board, pushing into the fibers so they're not going to tear out, and then after an inch or so, I switch the router to the other side of the board and push in from that side. This gives me crisp edges on both sides of the board. One challenge you're likely to encounter when cutting dados is a cupped board. You may have bought nothing but flat boards, but if you store them for even a day or two, they may cup slightly, and then it'll be difficult to cut your dado to a consistent depth from one edge to the other. The traditional way to deal with this is to use a router plane, and you just shave down the high spots, but you probably don't have a router plane. One way that you may deal with it is to try and cut your dados on the concave side of the board. This will ensure that the dados will be at full depth near the edges, and if it's going to be shallower, it'll be in the center. Then you can set your bit to cut a little bit deeper and make a second pass, but this time only in the center of the board, staying about a ½ inch away from each edge. This will deepen that shallow center, and even if you go a little bit too deep, it's not going to matter because the edges are what everyone will see. This project includes a few stop dados as well. To cut them, I lay out the end of the dado on the board, and then I align my router plate so that line goes right through the center hole. In that position, I just place a mark with a pencil on the edge guide. Now I know where to stop cutting. I can cut the dado just as I would any other, stopping at that point. I forgot to stop on one of my stop dados, but frankly, it doesn't matter. Nobody's ever going to see that mistake in the assembled project. In fact, you could cut all your dados the full width of the board if you want. I just think stop dados are a little tidier. They make your board as strong as possible because you don't have a dado where you don't need it, and it's a nice skill to have for future projects when they might matter. Here I'm cutting a rabbet on an edge that will then turn into a dado deeper into the board. I was really careful to line this cut up with the edge of the workpiece, and I made sure that I started my cut on the rabbet side, cutting just a little bit in. Then I finished my cut from the other direction. Again, I'm avoiding tear out on both sides, which would look terrible on that corner where the rabbet ends in the assembled project. After the dados are cut, it's time to start sanding. I had to move this inside because it started to rain. I start with 80 grit, then 120, and finally 180. Don't skip your grits, they each have a purpose. The 80 grit will level the surface and remove machine marks that you might not know are even there, but they're going to show up after the finish, like they did on this project. See those surface ripples? Those are from the planers used at the mill. The 80 grit will take that out of there. 120 grit will remove any swirls left behind by the coarse 80 grit. And finally, your 150 grit will give you your finished surface. I don't think you should go any higher than 150 if you're going to put a colored finish on this. It's also much easier to sand the parts before you assemble them, even if you end up having to do some touch-ups later. I also took this opportunity to make a modification to my design. I decided I just didn't like these straight boxy side panels I originally intended. So I laid out a curve. I started about an inch below the dados near the top of the side panel, and I ended it about an inch above that little rabbet near the bottom of the side panel. I kept that distance from the rabbet and the dados because I worried that it might chip away if I started a curve right next to the dado and rabbet. The shape of the curve doesn't really matter, whatever looks good to you. You'll notice I put tape on the surface where my curve is to be cut. This is 2 layers of painter's tape to just strengthen the fibers and prevent a ragged cut as the jigsaw's teeth pull upward with each stroke. I also clamped my 2 side panels together so both curves would be roughly the same. Cut carefully, trying to make a nice smooth curve. You'll have to do some hand sanding to even it out when you're done, but I think it's well worth the effort. In our next video, we'll start our assembly and we'll put on a finish. When that video is available, I'll put a link in the description below this one. We'll see you then. Who says you can't get track saw quality cuts from a simple circular saw? Boratool's new WTX clamp edge guide system is light, it's easily portable, and it's far less expensive. And with the optional router and jigsaw attachments, the system's more versatile too. Check it out at the link in the notes below this video. Wait, don't go yet. If you're new here, please subscribe and remember to ring the bell. I would really appreciate that. Give us a thumbs up, or better yet, leave us a comment. I always read them. And be sure to check out the latest issue of Stumpy Nubs Woodworking Journal. It's always packed with tips, tricks, and tutorials designed to make you a better woodworker.